Are taxis a thing of the past? How did Uber and Lyft start? How much do the drivers make? Why hail a cab when today there's an app for that? From hitchhiker to carpool to app. We live in a time where rideshare apps like Uber and Lyft transport millions of people every day. But have you ever wondered what the first rideshare was? Basically, it was hitchhiking. Back then, you didn't need an app. You stood on the side of the road, stuck out your thumb, and hoped someone would stop and pick you up. Maybe not the safest way to get a ride, though. Then, decades ago, people would exploit their coworkers by carpooling. It started as a rationing tactic during the Second World War, but it returned in the mid-1970s due to an energy crisis. So how did today's ride-sharing apps ever get off the ground? Well, the internet helped, of course, but the modern app-based rideshare concept is credited to Sunil Paul. Paul patented the idea of hailing a ride through a mobile app in 2002. He went on to launch Sidecar in 2011, which only lasted for 4 years. Now, Uber and Lyft dominate the world of app-based ride-sharing. From taxi to modern rideshare. Traditionally, if you wanted a taxi, you used to only have two choices: go to a taxi stand or hail one on the street. As technology advanced, you were able to call a dispatcher by phone. Limousines were also available, but they didn't wait at taxi stands and were much more expensive. Rides could only be arranged by calling a dispatcher until the modern app was invented. Taxi and limo drivers were either individual contractors or employees of a company, depending on the state or country they were operating in. Back then, you typically paid cash to the driver upon arriving at your destination. That has changed with the implementation of modern mobile payment systems. Now, transactions are mostly done digitally. If you've ever tried to hail a cab in New York, you know that it's no easy task. Luckily, rideshare companies now use an app to match drivers with their passengers. Passengers can get a quote up front according to their pickup location and their desired destination. They must accept the quote before starting the trip, and the fare is paid through their debit or credit card. Passengers can also track the driver's location, get an estimate on the driver's time of arrival, and follow the route to their destination. This allows for much greater transparency for the customer. After the ride is completed, passengers are asked to rate their driver. The driver also assigns the customer a passenger rating. All these useful features are relatively new and did not exist before ride-sharing apps, but now they are here to stay. Did you know that unlike taxicabs, an Uber or Lyft can't be legally hailed from the street? Uber started offering rides in 2010 in San Francisco. The Uber app launched internationally 5 years later, and it is now available in more than 80 countries worldwide. Lyft also made its debut in San Francisco, but a couple years later in 2012. They also operated as part of a carpool program called Zimride, which only became available internationally in 2017. A year later, they celebrated the milestone of having completed 1 billion rides. Pretty impressive, to say the least. For many decades, if you saw a movie set in New York City, you would often see a huge number of yellow taxis. Well, in 2017, it was reported that rideshare apps such as Uber and Lyft generated 65% more rides than taxis did in New York. The taxi industry has struggled in a world where ride-sharing apps have become the norm. Uber versus Lyft. Although there are a few other rideshare operators in the United States, much like Coke and Pepsi, Uber and Lyft dominate their market. More than a third of Americans use such a service, and it's mainly Uber and Lyft. Back in 2015, Uber had a 91% market share, but that number dropped to 68% in 2021 due to competition from Lyft, among others. Uber operates internationally in more than 900 cities on multiple continents. Lyft, however, is currently only available in the US and Canada. So how much money can you really make driving passengers? If you're a company, apparently several billion dollars. Uber earned $11.1 billion, and Lyft's revenue amounted to over $2 billion in 2020. Who wishes they had bought that stock now? Normally, you would think a wealthy company might attract loyal workers, but in this case, not so much. Drivers are independent contractors, and around 20% of them work for both Uber and Lyft. So much for brand loyalty. I bet Coke and Pepsi wouldn't tolerate that. Part of the reason may be because both companies have similar rules and hourly wages. How do these two companies measure up in terms of services? Uber offers a few services that Lyft doesn't, but they generally compete on the same level. Both Uber and Lyft even provide car rental and leasing options with third-party companies. Please take a second and hit that like button and subscribe to never miss out. Taxi driver versus rideshare driver. Before ride-sharing apps became popular, becoming a taxi driver was a longer and more difficult process than it is today. In response to the growth of services such as Uber and Lyft, taxi company policies have had to change to attract new drivers. That hasn't changed the fact that becoming a taxi driver today is still much more demanding than it is to drive for Uber or Lyft. The path towards becoming a taxi driver differs depending on the city. In London, drivers must take the world's most difficult exam called the Knowledge. The exam was first introduced in the 1860s, with preparation for the test typically taking a candidate between 2 to 4 years. All licensed taxi drivers in London were required to have detailed knowledge of the city. Candidates had to commit to memory a total of 320 routes across London and had to remember all its major landmarks. This included over 60,000 streets and details of all their one-way and restricted turns. In New York, taxi drivers can operate different types of taxis in 3 different colors: green, black, and the most popular one, yellow. Each operated under different rules. The traditional yellow cabs are also known as medallion cabs due to the limited number of 13,000 badges sold, a decision that the New York City Council made in the 1930s. The green taxis aren't required to have a medallion, but they can only operate in restricted areas of the city and aren't allowed airport pickups. During the 70s, the black car industry was created to serve corporate customers. Black cars did not have a limit on the number of vehicles in operation like yellow taxis and did not require a medallion. This was the area of legislation that allowed the modern rideshare service model to be born. Recently, over 100,000 active cars were part of the black car service class in New York alone. So how difficult is it to become a New York cabbie? In 2015, the TLC, the Taxi and Limousine Commission, made some changes in response to GPS technology and the emergence of rival ride-sharing companies. They started to limit the number of geography-related questions on its required test for drivers of the city's yellow cabs. The following year also saw the TLC eliminate the English test, making it easier for immigrants who make up over 90% of drivers in New York City. In 2021, the commission also eliminated the mandatory annual drug test for cannabis. I guess the new motto for yellow cabs is, "We'll get there when we get there." Rideshare apps don't have the same policies as taxi companies. If you want to become a rideshare driver, all you need is a car, a driver's license, a phone, and the successful completion of a background check. Drivers must be at least 21 years old, with some states requiring drivers to be 25. Drivers must have at least 1 year of driving experience, but they will need 3 years if they are under 23 years of age. Additionally, they must have a valid driver's license, a valid auto insurance policy that meets liability requirements, car registration, and a relatively new car. The final requirements are to pass a criminal background check and to own a smartphone. It's a much more accessible model for drivers than the taxi industry. No wonder ride-sharing apps continued to grow in popularity over taxis. This is the 2020s, not the 20th century. A lot has changed since then, and unless someone invents time travel, we're not going back. Rideshare drivers, is it worth it? Have you ever wondered how much people make driving for a rideshare company? Lyft drivers work for an average of $17.37 per hour, while the average Uber driver earns $16.90 per hour. This rate depends on whether driving during peak hours and the city they're in. The average Uber driver in San Diego, for example, earns $12.60 per hour, while a driver in New York City earns on average $29.34 an hour. Those who are considering driving for Uber are cautioned to learn about possible expenses before they start driving. Expenses can amount to 20 to 30% of their earnings. Oh, and don't forget, Uber takes a 25% commission on every fare. Drivers are responsible for paying income taxes and the self-employment tax. Due to pressure from drivers, the city of New York held an investigation into the actual earnings of for-hire drivers. Despite the economic success of many rideshare companies, most drivers weren't sharing in the financial success. The commission found 85% of the drivers who owned and maintained their cars were earning less than the $15 per hour minimum wage. The commission created a new formula where the drivers would earn a minimum salary with gross earnings of $27.86 per hour and net income of $17.22 per hour after expenses. In an expensive city like New York, that's much better. As for taxi driver profits in New York, the city mandate is $15 an hour and drivers keep their tips. Fares: taxi versus rideshare. Taxi companies have calculated fares by using a taximeter, a mechanical machine that remained unchanged until electronic meters were introduced in the 1980s. Fares were totaled using a base fee and the addition of a per-mile rate. Once you arrived at your destination, you would pay the driver with cash. Yes, cash. Can you believe it? Now, taxi companies offer an alternative payment option to their customers. Rates for the metered fares usually include an initial charge of $2.50. It also included an additional 50 cents per 1/5 mile when traveling above 12 miles per hour or per 60 seconds in slow traffic or when the vehicle is stopped. Another 50 cents would be added as an MTA state surcharge for all trips ending in New York City and certain local areas. Confusing? Well, wait, that's not all. Don't forget the 30-cent improvement surcharge, a 50-cent overnight surcharge if you're traveling between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m., and a $1 rush hour surcharge from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. on weekdays. Finally, the New York State congestion surcharge of $2.50 for yellow taxis or $2.75 for green taxis on all trips that begin and/or pass through Manhattan South. Wow! Taxi cab bureaucracy. Who knew? An alternative involves licensed e-hail providers offering upfront pricing in all participating yellow and green taxicabs. All passengers riding in medallion taxicabs can receive binding fare quotes when completing an e-hail request. This means the meter won't be turned on. Each e-hail company sets their own rates and will give you an estimate prior to sending a taxi. An extra reassurance for the customer is that if you received a binding fare quote, you only pay the fare quote that you accepted. Currently, rideshare services such as Uber calculate both upfront and post-trip fares depending on the city the passenger rides with Uber. The fares include a base rate, rates for estimated time and distance of the route, as well as the demand for rides in the area. In other words, rates change based on supply and demand. What's the future for rideshare services? As incredible as it may sound, we may soon be flying in Uber vehicles. Uber has contracts with 5 companies that produce aircraft utilizing vertical takeoff and landing, or VTOL aircraft. This includes Bell, which presented one of the first Uber aerial taxis in 2019. Uber also plans to start commercial air flights by as early as 2023. Does this mean flying cars are here at last? We've already seen Uber expand to include Uber Eats. Will we soon be seeing Uber Air? Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell.